I stood frozen in the conference room as Madison, the founder's 26-year-old daughter and newly appointed chief operating officer, slammed her laptop shut and pointed directly at me. Her voice cut through the shocked silence of our monthly all-hands meeting. Gemma has been using company resources for personal business. I've reviewed her email logs myself. Effective immediately, she's terminated. Security will escort her out. 200 employees stared at me. My hands shook. I had given this company everything for 3 years. Everything. The walk to my office felt like a funeral procession. Jake and Marcus from security flanked me, their eyes fixed straight ahead. These were guys I'd joked with in the break room, men who'd asked me for legal advice when their landlords tried to cheat them. Now they wouldn't even look at me. My hands trembled as I threw personal items into a cardboard box someone had silently provided. The framed photo of my law school graduation. The coffee mug my mother sent me last Christmas with "World's Best Attorney" printed on it. A small succulent plant I'd managed to keep alive for 2 years. These tiny pieces of my life at Technova Solutions felt pathetic now, reduced to objects that could fit in a box meant for shipping paper. Around me, colleagues I'd considered friends turned away or whispered behind their hands. Sarah from marketing, who I'd helped review her apartment lease. Tom from engineering, whose divorce papers I'd looked over as a favor. David from sales, who'd invited me to his wedding just 6 months ago. All of them avoiding my gaze like I'd committed some unforgivable sin. Only Diane from human resources caught my eye. We'd been close, sharing lunches and complaints about Madison's increasingly erratic management style. She stood near the door, her face pale, and mouthed, "I'm sorry," before looking away. But she didn't intervene. She didn't defend me. Nobody did. My mind raced through the past 3 years. The late nights drafting contracts under impossible deadlines. The weekends I'd sacrificed. Missing my cousin's wedding and my best friend's baby shower because Technova needed me. The family Thanksgivings I'd cut short to handle emergencies that, looking back, probably weren't emergencies at all. I'd been Technova's first and only in-house attorney, hired when the company was just 30 employees crammed into a cramped office space in the tech district. Thomas Bradford, the founder, had personally recruited me. I was 2 years out of law school, working 100-hour weeks at Henderson and Wright, one of the city's most prestigious firms. Thomas offered me less money but more meaning. "Help me build something that matters," he'd said. "Be part of the foundation, not just a cog in someone else's machine." I'd believed him. I'd taken a 30% pay cut because I believed in Technova's mission to make cybersecurity accessible to small businesses. I'd watched the company grow from 30 employees to 200, helped negotiate every major partnership, drafted every employment contract, protected Thomas's vision at every turn, and I'd been promised equity. "Next funding round," Thomas always said. Then the next funding round came and went. "We need to wait until we're more stable," became the new refrain. I'd waited because I trusted him, because I believed my loyalty would be rewarded. Now we were 200 strong, valued at over $300 million, and I was being escorted out like a criminal. Thomas had been my mentor once. After his wife Patricia died from cancer 2 years ago, I'd stepped up. I'd handled company matters while he grieved, worked with outside counsel to keep operations running, even helped arrange Patricia's memorial service when Thomas was too devastated to make decisions. I'd seen him at his lowest, had believed we'd formed a bond beyond employer and employee. But Thomas had changed after Patricia's death. He'd withdrawn, become distant and distracted. When Madison moved back from New York 6 months ago, claiming she wanted to help her father, Thomas had immediately made her chief operating officer. Never mind that Madison had 0 technology experience, 0 business operations background beyond a mediocre MBA and a brief stint at her uncle's real estate company. She was his daughter, and he'd been too grief-stricken to see what I'd seen from day one. Madison didn't want to help. She wanted to control. Within weeks of her arrival, the company culture shifted. 3 senior executives, all Thomas's original hires and all fiercely loyal to the company's mission, were pushed out. Madison brought in her own people. Sorority sisters, college friends, people whose primary qualification seemed to be their willingness to agree with whatever Madison said. The innovative, collaborative environment I'd loved transformed into something political and hierarchical, where loyalty to Madison mattered more than competence. I'd been one of the last of the old guard standing, and now I understood why. Sitting in my car in the parking lot, I couldn't stop the tears. My phone showed dozens of missed calls from my mother. Carol Bradford, no relation to Thomas despite sharing a last name, was a retired teacher in Ohio who'd sacrificed everything to put me through college and law school. This would break her heart, but before I could call her back, my phone buzzed with a new email. The sender was Bernard Walsh, senior partner at Whitmore and Associates, Technova's outside legal counsel. Bernard had been practicing law for 30 years and had a reputation for being unflappable. We'd worked together on several matters, but he'd never contacted me directly outside of formal meetings. The subject line read, "Emergency board meeting called. Your immediate attendance required." My hands shook as I opened the email. The message was brief and formal. "Miss Bradford, an emergency meeting of Technova's board of directors has been called for 6 o'clock this evening. Your attendance is required. Please confirm receipt of this message. Bernard Walsh, Whitmore and Associates." I checked the timestamp. The meeting was in 4 hours. Why would they want me at a board meeting after publicly firing me? Board meetings were for executives and investors, not terminated employees. Bernard had never contacted me this way before. The formality of the message, the word required instead of requested, the emergency nature of the call, none of it made sense. Unless something was very, very wrong. I read the email 3 more times, looking for clues. Then I started my car and drove home, my mind spinning with confusion and the faintest, most dangerous spark of hope. My apartment felt too quiet when I walked in. I'd lived here for 3 years, ever since joining Technova. It was a modest 1-bedroom in a neighborhood that was trying hard to be trendy but couldn't quite shake its working-class roots. The rent was manageable even on my reduced salary, which had been important when I was still paying down $80,000 in law school loans. I dropped my cardboard box of personal items on the kitchen counter and stared at it. Everything I'd accumulated at Technova fit in one box. 3 years of my life, reduced to a coffee mug and a dying plant. My phone rang. My mother. I couldn't avoid it any longer. "Gemma, honey. I've been calling all afternoon. Are you okay?" The sound of her voice broke something loose in my chest. "Mom, I got fired." The outrage in her response was immediate and fierce. "What? How dare they? After everything you've done for that company, I'm driving down there right now. We'll sue them for wrongful termination. We'll take them for everything they have." Despite everything, I almost smiled. My mother, the retired elementary school teacher who'd raised me alone after my father left, had always been my fiercest defender. "Mom, you don't need to drive 6 hours. I'm okay. I just need to figure out what happened." "What do you mean, what happened?" "They fired you. Illegally, I'm sure. There's a board meeting tonight. They've asked me to attend. Something strange is going on. Be careful, sweetheart. Companies don't fire people and then invite them to board meetings unless they're trying to trick you into something." We talked for 20 more minutes, my mother alternating between fury at Technova and concern for my well-being. She wanted me to come home to Ohio, to take time to recover, to let her take care of me like she had when I was young. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I understood what had just happened to my life. After we hung up, I did what any good lawyer would do. I started investigating. My personal laptop held copies of all my work emails. It was a habit I'd developed in law school after a professor told a horror story about an attorney who lost a major case because her firm's email server crashed and she had no backup of crucial correspondence. I'd been meticulous about keeping personal records ever since. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing every email I'd sent in the past 3 months, trying to understand what Madison had flagged as personal business. The answer emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in chemicals. Multiple draft emails to law firms. Messages marked confidential. Attorney work product. Extensive correspondence with Bernard Walsh that someone without context might find suspicious. And repeated references to something called Project Sentinel. Project Sentinel. The code name I'd given to the most important work I'd done at Technova. It had started 3 months ago when I noticed something odd in our client retention data. Several major clients had left Technova for CompSecure, our biggest competitor, within weeks of each other. That alone wasn't necessarily suspicious, but the pattern was. They were all clients who'd been brought in by Derek Hansen. Derek had been Technova's VP of Client Relations until Madison fired his entire team 18 months ago as part of her restructuring. He'd left bitter and landed at CompSecure within a month. At the time, I'd thought it was just corporate musical chairs, the kind of personnel movement that happens constantly in the tech industry. But 3 months ago, I'd started to suspect it was more than that. I'd discovered that Derek was systematically targeting Technova clients, offering them deals that seemed too good to be true. More than that, he appeared to be using proprietary information he'd stolen before leaving. Client preferences, pricing strategies, even specific vulnerabilities in our competitors' products that Technova had identified through months of research, information that should have been protected by his non-disclosure agreement. I'd spent the past 3 months building a legal case, gathering evidence of intellectual property theft, documenting the pattern of client poaching, preparing cease and desist notices that would be the first step in what could become a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. I'd kept it quiet because the evidence was still being gathered, because I wanted to be absolutely certain before making accusations that could damage both companies' reputations. I'd been working with Bernard Walsh's firm as outside counsel, using them to investigate without tipping off Derek or CompSecure. Thomas knew about Project Sentinel. We'd discussed it in several private meetings, but he'd insisted we keep it confidential, even from other executives. "I don't want this leaking before we're ready to move," he'd said. "Madison has a tendency to talk to her friends. Keep this between us and Bernard." So Madison hadn't known. She'd seen my correspondence with Bernard, my references to confidential legal matters, my draft cease and desist notices, and she'd assumed they were evidence of personal wrongdoing. Or had she? I stood up from my laptop and paced my small living room. Something didn't add up. Madison wasn't stupid. Reckless, entitled, and power-hungry. Yes, but not stupid. She had to know that firing a company's general counsel without cause would raise red flags. She had to know that Thomas would question it, unless Thomas was out of the picture, unless Madison was moving faster than anyone anticipated, unless this wasn't about misunderstanding my emails at all. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it, expecting spam. Instead, I read, "They're setting you up. Madison found your cease and desist drafts. She's telling the board you were planning to sue Technova personally. She's spinning it as you threatening the company. Bernard knows the truth, but Thomas is in the Cayman Islands and unreachable. You need proof. Check the shared legal drive, folder MJ Personal, password is Patricia2022. Madison doesn't know it exists. You have 2 hours." My heart hammered against my ribs. I read the message 3 times, looking for any indication of who sent it. The number was local but unfamiliar. No signature. No context. Someone was helping me. But who? And how did they know about the shared legal drive? About the password? About what Madison was planning? I grabbed my laptop and logged into Technova's shared legal drive, a secure server that only I, Thomas, and Bernard had access to. At least, that's what I'd thought. I found the folder labeled MJ Personal. Madison's initials. I'd never seen it before. The password, Patricia2022, worked on the first try. Patricia's name and the year she died. What I found inside made my blood run cold. The folder contained hundreds of files. I started clicking through them, my disbelief growing with each new document. Madison's personal emails, discussing removing obstacles in her path to controlling Technova. My name appeared repeatedly. Gemma is too loyal to Dad. She'll figure out what we're doing if we're not careful. Another email, sent just 2 weeks ago. The lawyer is getting close. Derek says she's been asking questions about client lists. We need to move up the timeline. Financial records showing Madison had been in secret negotiations to sell Technova. The buyer was CompSecure, the same company Derek worked for. The same company I'd been building a case against for intellectual property theft. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Derek and Madison weren't just poaching clients. They were planning a hostile acquisition. Derek would convince CompSecure to buy Technova at a fraction of its real value, and Madison would deliver the company on a silver platter. I scrolled through spreadsheets showing the proposed deal. CompSecure would pay $120 million for a company actually worth over $300 million. But Madison didn't care about Technova's real value. She cared about her personal payout, $30 million. The emails between Madison and Derek went back 4 months. They'd been coordinating everything. Derek identified which clients to poach to weaken Technova's valuation. Madison deliberately sabotaged internal projects to make the company appear less stable. Together, they were systematically destroying Thomas's life's work so they could profit from the wreckage. And I'd been the biggest threat to their plan, because my cease and desist notices would prove that CompSecure's rapid growth was built on stolen Technova technology. That revelation would kill the acquisition deal instantly. What board would approve buying a company if it meant inheriting a massive lawsuit for intellectual property theft? I kept reading, my horror deepening. Madison had been working on another angle, getting Thomas declared temporarily unfit to serve as CEO. She'd been corresponding with a psychiatrist, discussing her father's deteriorating mental state following his wife's death. She documented instances of concerning behavior, most of which I recognized as Thomas simply being distracted or sad. Normal grief responses twisted into evidence of incompetence. I found a copy of Technova's corporate bylaws with one section highlighted. If the CEO was declared temporarily unable to fulfill duties, the chief operating officer would assume proxy voting rights for the CEO's shares. Thomas controlled 51% of Technova's voting shares. If Madison got proxy control, even temporarily, she could force through the sale over any objections from the venture capital board members. The plan was elegant and ruthless. Discredit Thomas, remove me, rush through the acquisition before anyone else figured out what was happening. Madison and Derek would walk away rich, and 200 people would lose their jobs when CompSecure inevitably gutted Technova and absorbed whatever pieces they wanted. I was frantically downloading files when my laptop screen flickered. A message appeared. Remote access detected. Files are being deleted in real time. I watched in helpless horror as documents began disappearing from the folder. Someone, somewhere, was erasing the evidence. The files I'd just been reading vanished one by one, deleted faster than I could save them. My fingers flew across the keyboard, trying to download everything I could. I managed to grab about 40% of the files before the entire folder went empty, replaced with a simple message. Access denied. My phone rang, the sudden sound making me jump. Bernard Walsh's name appeared on the screen. I answered, my voice shaky. Bernard? Gemma. Where are you? His normally calm voice was tight with stress. Madison just convinced 2 board members you've been embezzling from the company. She has bank statements showing transfers to your account. She's pushed the meeting up. It starts in 30 minutes. If you're not here, they'll vote to authorize your arrest. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, my mind reeling. Embezzlement. Fabricated bank statements. Pushed-up timeline. Madison was moving faster than I could counter. 30 minutes. I had 30 minutes to get across town, to somehow defend myself against accusations I didn't even fully understand yet. To prove my innocence, with incomplete evidence. I grabbed my laptop, the USB drive I'd hastily saved the partial files to, and my car keys. Whatever was waiting for me at Technova's headquarters, I was out of time to prepare for it. As I ran to my car, one thought kept echoing through my mind. Someone had sent me that text message. Someone had given me access to Madison's files. Someone inside Technova was trying to help me. I just had to hope it would be enough. I'd never driven through the city like this before. Traffic was heavy, the late afternoon rush already clogging the main arteries. I took side streets, ran yellow lights that were probably red, and silently apologized to every driver I cut off. My mind raced faster than my car. 30 minutes. I'd left my apartment with 28 minutes to spare. The drive normally took 40 minutes. I was doing calculations in my head, adjusting my route, taking risks I'd never normally take. The partial files I'd downloaded sat on a USB drive in my purse. Would they be enough? I'd gotten maybe 40% of what was in that folder. Financial records, some emails, proof that Madison and Derek were communicating. But I didn't have everything. I didn't have the psychiatrist correspondence. I didn't have all the acquisition documents, and I had no idea what these fabricated bank statements looked like, or how convincing Madison had made them. I thought about Bernard's voice on the phone, stressed, worried. But why had he called to warn me? If Madison had already convinced board members I was embezzling, why give me a chance to show up and defend myself? Unless Bernard didn't believe the accusations. Unless he'd seen enough of my work on Project Sentinel to know I wasn't capable of what Madison was claiming. Or unless this was a trap, and I was driving straight into it. My phone rang again. My mother. I couldn't talk to her now. Not while driving like a maniac through rush-hour traffic. I let it go to voicemail, and kept my eyes on the road. I thought about what Madison had done. The public humiliation at the all-hands meeting. The security escort. The systematic destruction of my reputation. In front of 200 colleagues. She could have fired me quietly, called me into her office, handed me a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement. Instead, she'd made it a spectacle, because she'd wanted to destroy my credibility before I could fight back. She'd wanted everyone at Technova to see me as a cheater, a liar, someone using company resources for personal gain. That way, when the embezzlement charges came, people would already believe I was capable of it. It was calculated, methodical, and it had almost worked. I was 10 minutes from Technova's headquarters when I realized something else. Thomas was in the Cayman Islands. The text message had told me that. But why the Cayman Islands? Thomas didn't take vacations. He hadn't left the country since Patricia died, unless he wasn't on vacation. The Cayman Islands were a banking haven, a place where wealthy people parked money, where corporations set up offshore accounts, where financial investigations often led. What if Thomas wasn't unreachable because he was grieving? What if he was there working? I pulled into Technova's parking garage with 6 minutes to spare. The building loomed above me, all glass and steel and modern architecture, a monument to Thomas's success. I'd spent 3 years in this building. I'd helped protect it, nurture it, and defend it. Now I was returning to save my own life. The parking garage was mostly empty at this hour. I grabbed my purse, checked that the USB drive was still inside, and headed for the elevators. My reflection in the polished metal doors showed a woman who looked nothing like the confident attorney who'd walked into the all-hands meeting this morning. My eyes were red from crying. My hair was disheveled. My blouse was wrinkled from being clutched in my cardboard box. I looked like exactly what Madison wanted me to look like, desperate and guilty. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt endless. I tried to compose myself, to find the calm, professional demeanor I'd cultivated through law school and years of practice, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The executive floor was quiet. Most people had gone home for the day, but I could hear voices coming from the boardroom at the end of the hall. Raised voices. Angry voices. I walked slowly down the corridor, my heels clicking on the polished floor. As I got closer, I could make out individual words. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt endless. I tried to compose myself, to find the calm, professional demeanor I'd cultivated through law school and years of practice, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Madison's voice, confident and authoritative. The evidence is clear. Gemma has been systematically embezzling from Technova for months. These bank statements show transfers totaling over $200,000. Another voice. Grace Hartley, the independent board director. Shouldn't we wait for Miss Bradford to arrive? Bernard said she was coming. Madison's response was quick. If she shows up at all. Honestly, I think she's probably fled. She knows what she's done. She knows we have proof. Bernard Walsh's voice cut through, measured but uncertain. Madison, I've worked with Gemma on several sensitive legal matters. This doesn't align with anything I've seen from her professionally. That's exactly what she was counting on, Madison said. Your trust. My father's trust. Everyone's trust. She manipulated all of you while stealing from the company she pretended to care about. I reached the boardroom door and paused. My hand on the handle. Through the narrow window, I could see them all seated around the long conference table. Madison at the head, where Thomas usually sat. Bernard to her right, looking uncomfortable. 3 venture capital representatives, including Richard Porter. Grace Hartley taking notes, and no Thomas. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and prepared to walk into the room. But before I could turn the handle, the door opened from inside. Diane stood there, my former friend from HR. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Mascara streaked her cheeks. She looked at me with an expression that mixed guilt, relief, and something like desperation. "Thank God you're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry. I should have told you sooner. Madison threatened to fire me and ruin my career if I warned you, but I can't let this happen." She grabbed my hand and pressed something into my palm. A USB drive, smaller than mine but similar. "Everything you need is on here," Diane said, speaking quickly, urgently. The real bank statements showing Madison fabricated the transfers, security footage of Madison accessing your computer after hours, and recordings of Madison and Derek discussing the acquisition. "I've been documenting everything for 2 months. I sent you that text. Go in there and destroy her." I stared at Diane, at this woman I'd thought had abandoned me. "You've been helping me this whole time? I should have done more sooner." But I was scared. Tears ran down her face. "I'm not scared anymore. Go. They're waiting." I gripped both USB drives in my hand, feeling their weight. Evidence, proof, the truth. I walked into the boardroom, and every conversation stopped. Madison's face went pale, then flushed bright red. She stood up so fast her chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "How dare you show up here after what you've done?" I walked to the empty chair across from her and sat down, my movements deliberate and calm. Inside, my heart was racing, but I'd spent years in courtrooms and depositions. I knew how to project confidence I didn't feel. "I was invited to this board meeting," I said, my voice steady. "Bernard sent me a formal notice. I'm here to address the accusations being made against me." Richard Porter, a silver-haired man in his 50s who'd made his fortune in early tech investments, leaned forward. "Miss Bradford, you understand you're being accused of embezzlement. This is an extremely serious matter. I understand that someone has made serious accusations, I replied. I'd like the opportunity to respond before any votes are taken or any decisions are made. Grace Hartley, the independent director and a former CEO herself, nodded. That seems reasonable. Madison, I think we should hear what Gemma has to say. Madison's hands clenched into fists on the table. She's just going to lie. The evidence speaks for itself. Then let her speak, Grace said firmly, and we'll compare her testimony to the evidence. That's how these things should be handled. I pulled out my laptop and connected it to the boardroom's display system. Diane handed me a cable without being asked, then stepped back to stand against the wall. Her presence felt like a lifeline. I'd like to start by addressing the bank statements Madison has presented, I said. I inserted Diane's USB drive and pulled up the files. These are the genuine bank statements from my personal account for the past 6 months. The documents appeared on the large screen. Clean, simple statements from my local credit union showing my modest salary deposits, my rent payments, my student loan payments, and not much else. Now, I'd like to see the statements Madison is using as evidence. Madison hesitated, then pulled up her files. The fabricated statements appeared on a second screen. They looked similar to mine but showed regular transfers of large amounts. $5,000 here, $10,000 there, totaling over $200,000 as Madison had claimed. Notice the account numbers, I said, standing and pointing to the screen. Madison's version shows an account number ending in 7749. My actual account ends in 3216. Also, notice the bank name. Madison's version says, First National Bank. I don't have an account at First National. I bank with Metro Credit Union. Stephen Wright, one of the younger venture capital representatives, leaned forward to study the screens. Those are completely different accounts, because one set is real and one is fabricated, I said. I can provide documentation from Metro Credit Union verifying every transaction in my actual account. Madison's statements are forgeries. Madison's voice rose. She probably has multiple accounts. Criminals always do. Then I invite the board to request my financial records directly from any bank, I said calmly. I'll sign any release forms necessary. You'll find I have exactly one checking account, one savings account, and a retirement account that I barely contribute to because I'm still paying off $80,000 in student loans. I pulled up the next file. But more importantly, I'd like to show you how Madison obtained the information to create these forgeries. Security footage appeared on the screen. Black and white. Time-stamped. Unmistakable. Madison entering my office at 11:14 p.m. on a Tuesday night 3 weeks ago. The camera angle showed her sitting at my desk, typing on my computer. I always lock my computer when I leave, I said. Always. But Madison had it create a master password that bypasses individual user locks. She accessed my personal files, my bank information, everything she needed to create convincing forgeries. I played 2 more videos, both showing Madison in my office late at night, both showing her accessing my computer. Diane from HR can confirm that Madison requested these master passwords 6 weeks ago. She told Diane it was for security audits. Instead, she was building a case to destroy me. The room was silent except for the sound of people shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. I looked at Bernard Walsh, who was staring at the screens with an expression of growing understanding. Bernard, you know about Project Sentinel, I said. Would you like to explain to the board what that project involved? Bernard cleared his throat. Project Sentinel was a confidential investigation into intellectual property theft by Derek Hansen and CompSecure. Gemma has been building a comprehensive legal case for the past 3 months with my firm's assistance. I pulled up the cease and desist notices I'd drafted. These are what Madison called my personal emails. They're legal documents addressed to Derek Hansen and CompSecure, detailing allegations of trade secret theft, client poaching using stolen proprietary information, and violations worth potentially millions in damages. I displayed the documents on the screen, highlighting key passages. These weren't personal business. They were corporate legal weapons designed to protect Technova. Richard Porter sat back in his chair. Why didn't you bring this to the board sooner? Because Thomas wanted to keep it confidential, I said. He was concerned about leaks. We were still gathering evidence, still building the case to ensure we had everything we needed before making our accusations public. I took a breath and pulled up the final set of files from Diane's USB drive. But there's something else the board needs to know. Something much bigger than embezzlement accusations or leaked emails. The communications between Madison and Derek appeared on screen. Email after email. Text message after text message. All detailing the acquisition plan. Madison has been negotiating to sell Technova to CompSecure for $120 million. The company is actually worth over $300 million. She's been deliberately sabotaging Technova's valuation to make the sale attractive to CompSecure, while ensuring she personally receives $30 million. I let that sink in, watching the board members' faces shift from confusion to shock to anger. Derek's role in this plan was to position CompSecure as a buyer, while simultaneously weakening Technova by stealing clients and intellectual property. My cease and desist notices would have exposed the theft, which would have killed the acquisition deal. So Madison had to remove me before I could file them. Stephen Wright's face had gone red. Is this true? Madison, can you refute any of this? Madison's mouth opened and closed. Her confident demeanor had cracked. You don't understand. This is all taken out of context. Dad is sick. He's been making irrational decisions since Mom died. I was trying to protect the company, protect his legacy. By selling it for a fraction of its value? Grace Hartley's voice was sharp. By conspiring with the same person who's been stealing from us? CompSecure offered to keep the Technova brand, Madison said, her voice rising with desperation. They promised to honor what Dad built. I was trying to help, and Gemma was going to expose Dad's mental state in those legal filings. She was going to make him look incompetent. I had to protect him. She was crying now, real tears streaming down her face. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then the boardroom door opened. Thomas Bradford walked in, looking more alert and focused than I'd seen him in months. Beside him was a woman in a dark business suit carrying a leather briefcase. Madison, Thomas said quietly, his voice cutting through her tears. That's enough lies. Madison's face went white. Dad? You're supposed to be in the Cayman Islands meeting with our bankers? Thomas finished. I was. Not because I'm mentally ill, but because I've been investigating unauthorized access to company accounts. This is Agent Sarah Monroe from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. She has some questions for you. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Madison stood frozen, staring at her father like she'd seen a ghost. And I finally understood. Thomas had known. Maybe not everything, but enough. He'd been building his own case, gathering his own evidence. While Madison thought she was playing him, he'd been 3 steps ahead. Agent Monroe set her briefcase on the table and pulled out a tablet. Her voice was professional and detached. 3 weeks ago, Technova's primary bank flagged suspicious activity on your corporate accounts. Small transfers to offshore accounts, carefully routed through multiple shell companies. The amounts were modest enough to avoid immediate detection, but the pattern was clear to trained analysts. She pulled up financial records on her tablet and projected them onto the boardroom screen. The bank contacted Mr. Bradford directly, as he's the primary account holder. Rather than confront you immediately, Miss Bradford, he contacted federal authorities. I've been working with Mr. Bradford for the past 2 weeks to trace these transfers. Numbers flowed across the screen. Transfers of $3,000, $5,000, $7,000, all moving out of Technova's accounts and into a complex web of shell corporations. The total embezzled amount is $1.2 million, Agent Monroe continued. All traced back to accounts controlled by you, Madison Bradford. Madison's voice came out as a whisper. That's not possible. It's not only possible, it's documented. Agent Monroe said. You weren't just planning to sell the company for less than it's worth. You were also stealing from it to fund your lifestyle while the negotiations continued. Expensive hotels, first-class flights, designer purchases, all charged to shell company credit cards funded by Technova's money. Thomas hadn't moved from his position near the door. His face was gray, aged beyond his 53 years, but his voice was steady. I know I've been absent. After Patricia died, I lost myself for a while. I let Madison take advantage of that grief. I wanted to believe my daughter cared about this company, about her mother's memory. His voice broke slightly, but he pushed through. Patricia loved Technova. She believed in what we were building. She sat in on early board meetings when we were just an idea and a business plan. She helped name the company. This was her legacy as much as mine. He looked directly at Madison, and the pain in his eyes was awful to witness. Madison, you've betrayed everything your mother stood for, and you used my grief as cover. You let me think I was losing my mind, that my judgment was failing, when really you were systematically destroying what Patricia and I built together. Madison moved toward him, her hands outstretched. Dad, please, you don't understand. I just wanted. Thomas held up his hand, stopping her. No, I'm done being manipulated. I'm done making excuses for you. I'm done. The word hung in the air, like a final judgment. Madison's careful mask shattered completely. This is your fault, she screamed, her voice raw and ugly. You and Mom. You always loved this stupid company more than me. I grew up watching you work 100 hours a week. I watched Mom bring you dinner at the office because you couldn't be bothered to come home. I was always second to Technova. Always. The room was silent, shocked by the outburst. So yes, I wanted to burn it down, Madison continued, her voice dropping to something cold and vicious. I wanted to take everything you loved and sell it for parts. I wanted you to feel what I felt my whole childhood, abandoned and worthless. And I would have succeeded if Gemma hadn't been so pathetically loyal. She spat the last word like a curse. Agent Monroe gestured to two other agents I hadn't noticed standing outside the boardroom. They entered, moving with the practiced efficiency of law enforcement. Madison Bradford, you're under arrest for embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit corporate espionage. You have the right to remain silent. The Miranda rights continued as the agents handcuffed Madison. She didn't resist, didn't cry anymore, just stared at her father with an expression of pure hatred. As they led her toward the door, she turned back one final time. You think you've won, Gemma? You think Dad will keep you around? You're just an employee. I'm his daughter. I'll be out in hours and you'll still be nothing. Thomas's voice, when he responded, was like iron. Madison, you're not my daughter anymore. You stopped being my daughter when you dishonored your mother's memory. Gemma has shown me more loyalty and love than you ever did. He turned to address the board. I'm calling an emergency vote. I propose we offer Gemma Bradford a position as general counsel with a seat on this board, full equity stake of 5%, and a formal apology from Technova for her wrongful termination. All in favor? Every hand went up. Richard Porter, Stephen Wright, the third VC representative who'd barely spoken, Grace Hartley, Bernard Walsh, all of them. I stood there, tears streaming down my face. As Madison was escorted out screaming, Bernard Walsh stood and came around the table. Gemma, your work on Project Sentinel was exceptional. Without those cease and desist notices, we wouldn't have had the documentation to build the case against Derek and CompSecure. You protected this company when no one else could, Grace Hartley added. You showed remarkable integrity under a coordinated attack. I've been in business 40 years, and I've rarely seen someone handle adversity with such professionalism. Richard Porter shook my hand. You have my deepest respect. Your instincts were right about everything. I turned to Diane, who was still standing against the wall, crying quietly. I crossed the room and pulled her into a hug. You saved me. You risked everything. I should have done it sooner. Diane sobbed. I was so scared. But watching her destroy you, I couldn't stand by. Thomas approached us both. Diane, you showed tremendous courage. That won't be forgotten. Then he looked at me, his eyes wet with tears. Gemma, I owe you an apology that can never be enough. You protected this company when I was too blind to see the threat. You were the only one who stayed truly loyal. Thomas, I didn't know what to say. Patricia would have loved you, he said quietly. You have her integrity, her strength. That's the highest compliment I can give. As the board meeting dissolved into smaller conversations, as Agent Monroe finished her preliminary interviews, as the magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in, I finally let myself believe it. I'd won, not just survived, but won, and justice, delayed but not denied, had finally arrived. 3 months later, I stood in my new corner office, the one that had belonged to Madison, and watched the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and pink. It was early, barely 6 in the morning, but I'd always been an early riser. Some habits didn't change even when your entire life transformed. The office was different now. I'd removed all traces of Madison's tenure. The expensive, abstract art, the designer furniture, the vanity wall of magazine covers featuring rising business stars. In their place, I'd brought simplicity. My law school diploma, the photo of my mother and me at my graduation, a new, healthier, succulent plant, and on the wall behind my desk, a framed photo of Thomas and Patricia at Technova's first office. Both of them young and hopeful, and building something meaningful. The general counsel title still felt surreal some mornings. Not because I didn't deserve it, I'd learned that lesson thoroughly, but because the journey to get here had been so brutal. The 5% equity stake meant financial security for the first time in my adult life. I'd already paid off my student loans, all $80,000 of them. I'd bought my mother a new car to replace her 20-year-old sedan, and I'd started a small emergency fund, something I'd never been able to afford before. But more than the money or the title, the board seat gave me real power to protect the company I loved. I'd never be vulnerable the way I'd been 3 months ago. I had a voice now, a vote, and the respect of everyone in the room when I used it. Technova had survived the scandal. In some ways, we'd emerged stronger. The lawsuit against CompSecure had settled for $18 million 2 weeks ago. Derek Hansen had pleaded guilty to corporate espionage and been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. His lawyer had argued for leniency, claiming Derek had been manipulated by Madison. The judge hadn't bought it. CompSecure's board had been horrified to discover what Derek had been doing. They'd cooperated fully with the investigation, terminated Derek immediately, and agreed to the settlement to avoid a protracted legal battle. They'd also implemented new ethics training and oversight procedures, which I'd helped design as part of the settlement negotiations. The cease and desist notices I'd drafted had become the foundation for a major case study in corporate legal strategy. My old law school professor had called to ask if I'd be willing to present the case to his class. I'd agreed, still amazed that work I'd done in secret had become something other lawyers wanted to learn from. Technova had survived the scandal. In some ways, we'd emerged stronger. The lawsuit against CompSecure had settled for $18 million 2 weeks ago. Derek Hansen had pleaded guilty to corporate espionage and been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. His lawyer had argued for leniency, claiming Derek had been manipulated by Madison. The judge hadn't bought it. CompSecure's board had been horrified to discover what Derek had been doing. They'd cooperated fully with the investigation, terminated Derek immediately, and agreed to the settlement to avoid a protracted legal battle. They'd also implemented new ethics training and oversight procedures, which I'd helped design as part of the settlement negotiations. Patricia's sister told me something at the sentencing. He'd said, She said Patricia would be proud of how I handled this. That choosing truth over blood, justice over family loyalty, was what Patricia would have done. Madison had pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud 3 weeks into her detention. Her lawyer had negotiated a deal. 3 years in federal prison, full restitution of the $1.2 million she'd stolen, and permanent prohibition from serving as an officer or director of any public company. Thomas had attended the sentencing but hadn't spoken to her. He'd told me later that night, sitting in my office over coffee, that it was one of the hardest things he'd ever done. I failed as a father, he'd told me during one of our weekly meetings. I thought I was protecting her by making things easy. Instead, I taught her that she didn't have to earn anything, that she could take shortcuts and face no consequences. I'd argued with him, told him that Madison had made her own choices, that he couldn't blame himself for her decisions. But I understood his guilt. Love, even misguided love, left scars when it was betrayed. Thomas was healing, though, slowly, carefully, with professional help. He'd started dating a woman named Linda who ran a nonprofit focused on cybersecurity education for underserved communities. She was kind, straightforward, and completely uninterested in Technova's money or status. They'd met at a charity event, bonded over their shared commitment to making technology accessible, and Thomas seemed lighter when he talked about her. The executives Madison had pushed out had been invited back. 2 had accepted, grateful for the chance to return to a company they'd helped build. Marcus Chen from engineering and Laura Washington from product development had brought back institutional knowledge and loyalty that had been sorely missed. The 2 who declined had moved on to other opportunities, which we all understood and respected. The people Madison had brought in, her college friends and sorority sisters with their impressive resumes but limited actual competence, had mostly left voluntarily. A few had been let go when it became clear they'd known about Madison's plans and said nothing. Technova's culture had shifted back to something recognizable. Innovative, collaborative, merit-based. Diane was now Vice President of Human Resources, a promotion she'd earned through her courage and her skillful handling of the aftermath. She'd implemented new whistleblower protections, new ethics training, and new oversight procedures to ensure nothing like Madison's scheme could happen again. We had lunch together twice a week, our friendship stronger for having survived the crucible. I still have nightmares about it. She'd confessed over salads last week. I dreamed that I didn't send you that text, that you walked into that boardroom without evidence, that Madison won. But she didn't, I'd reminded her. You were brave when it mattered most. That's what counts. The all-hands meetings were different now, too. Thomas insisted on transparency, on open communication, on creating a culture where people felt safe raising concerns. The monthly meetings had become forums for honest discussion, not top-down pronouncements. People trusted leadership again, and that trust felt precious and fragile and worth protecting. My relationship with Thomas had evolved into something I couldn't quite categorize. He was my boss, yes, but also something like a mentor, and something like family. We met every week, ostensibly to discuss legal matters, but really to check in on each other. He'd told me I reminded him of Patricia in the best ways. Principled, resilient, committed to doing the right thing even when it was hard. Patricia would have loved you, he'd said more than once. And I'd learned to accept the compliment for what it was, the highest praise he could offer. But more than any external validation, I'd discovered something about myself through this nightmare. I'd learned that I was stronger than I'd believed. When everything was taken from me, when my reputation was destroyed and my career was in ruins, I didn't crumble. I fought back. I gathered evidence. I stood my ground. I'd also learned humility. I'd been naive to think loyalty alone would protect me. I should have documented Madison's behavior earlier. I should have built alliances instead of keeping my head down and focusing solely on my work. I should have recognized the warning signs when Madison started consolidating power. But I'd also learned that integrity matters. Even when falsely accused, even when the world seemed stacked against me, I'd held on to the truth. I hadn't lied or cheated or compromised my principles to save myself. And in the end, that integrity had been my salvation. The experience had taught me about power, too. Power wasn't inherently good or bad. It was a tool. And like any tool, it could be used to build or destroy. Madison had used her power to destroy. I was determined to use mine to build and protect. I thought about Madison sometimes, wondered what she was thinking in federal prison. Did she regret her choices? Did she understand the magnitude of what she'd destroyed? Or did she still see herself as the victim, wronged by a father who loved his company more than his daughter? I didn't know. Maybe I never would. But I'd made peace with it. Madison's choices were her own. Her consequences were her own. I couldn't fix her or save her. All I could do was move forward. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "So proud of you, sweetheart. Remember to eat breakfast. Love you." I smiled. Some things never changed. My mother would always worry about whether I was eating properly, no matter how successful I became. There was a knock on my door. Thomas stood there with 2 cups of coffee from the shop down the street. The good, expensive kind we both pretended we didn't need, but definitely appreciated. "Morning," he said. "Thought you might be here early. Big day today." Today we were presenting the results of our anti-poaching initiative to the board. 6 months of work, new client retention strategies, improved security protocols, everything we'd learned from the Madison disaster channeled into making Technova stronger. "Ready as I'll ever be," I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "You'll be great. You always are." He paused at the door. "Gemma, I never thanked you properly. For fighting back. For not giving up. For protecting this company even when it seemed like the company had abandoned you." "You don't have to thank me, Thomas. I did what was right." "I know. That's exactly why I'm thanking you." After he left, I stood at my window, watching the city wake up. Cars filled the streets. People hurried to jobs and meetings and lives that continued regardless of individual dramas. The world was big and indifferent, and yet here I was, still standing, still fighting, still building something meaningful. I thought about what I'd tell my younger self. The woman who'd walked into that all-hands meeting 3 months ago, with no idea her world was about to explode. I'd tell her to trust herself, to document everything, to find her allies, to never surrender her integrity no matter how desperate things got. But more than anything, I'd tell her that being fired wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of her truth. Because when someone tries to destroy your reputation, you have a choice. You can accept their narrative, internalize the shame, and disappear. Or you can build a case, gather your evidence, find your courage, and fight back with everything you have. I'd chosen to fight, and in fighting, I discovered who I really was. Not just Gemma Bradford, the attorney who worked too hard and trusted too easily, but Gemma Bradford, the woman who stood her ground when the world told her to fall, the woman who turned humiliation into vindication, the woman who transformed disaster into triumph. That woman was someone I was proud to be. My computer chimed with an email notification. A message from a law student asking for career advice. Having read about the Technova case in a legal journal, I opened it and started typing a response, thinking about what wisdom I'd actually gained from this experience. I wrote, "Trust your instincts. Document everything. Build genuine relationships, not just professional networks. Your integrity is your greatest asset. Protect it fiercely. And remember that setbacks, even devastating ones, can become setups for something better if you refuse to give up." I paused, then added one more line. "When they try to silence you by taking everything you've worked for, make sure you've kept receipts. Then present those receipts so clearly, so powerfully, that silence is the only possible response." I sent the email and turned back to my presentation notes. There was work to do, a company to protect, a future to build, and I was ready for all of it. So let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where someone tried to destroy your reputation or take credit for your work? How did you handle it? Did you fight back or walk away? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear how others have navigated workplace betrayal and come out stronger on the other side. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that truth and integrity still matter even in the darkest moments, please hit that like button. And if you believe others need to hear this message, that someone out there is facing their own Madison and needs to know they can survive and thrive, please share this story with them. Subscribe to hear more stories about resilience, justice, and the power of standing your ground when everything tells you to give up. Because we all face moments when our integrity is tested. What matters is how we respond. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember, your truth is your power. Never surrender it. Never apologize for it. And never let anyone convince you that loyalty means accepting injustice. Stay strong. Fight fair. Document everything. And know that you're capable of more than you imagine. Until next time.